He expected a black-edged letter announcing her death, a quiet end to a distasteful obligation. He had purchased a wife the way one might purchase a sickly calf, expecting it to perish before the season turned, a regrettable but necessary expenditure to satisfy the covenants of his title. He did not expect, years later, to return to the tomb he had left her in, a place of rot and ruin, only to find it breathing. He did not expect the scent of bread on the air, the sight of repaired fences, or the sound of voice he thought long silenced by damp and despair, giving orders with the quiet authority of a queen. He did not expect to find the woman he had abandoned to die, not only alive, but magnificent, and he certainly did not expect that in the heart of that reclaimed fortress, she had unlocked the one door he had prayed would remain bolted forever. The solicitor's office smelled of dry paper and drier promises, a dust-mote haze hanging in the thin afternoon light that did nothing to warm the room. It was a place for endings, not beginnings. Alastair, the 9th Duke of Blackwood, felt the sentiment keenly. He stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the gray London street below, seeing none of it. His mind was on troop movements in the colonies, on the whispers of instability in Parliament, on the crushing, grinding weight of a dukedom that was less a privilege and more a millstone. This business, this acquisition, was a footnote in a day already crowded with grim necessities. "Your Grace," Mr. Pettigrew, the solicitor, murmured, his voice oiled with a deference that bordered on reptilian. "If you would." Alastair turned. He allowed his gaze to drift over the two women seated before the vast mahogany desk. One was a distant cousin of some sort, a woman whose face was a pinched mask of avarice and desperation. The other was the object of the transaction, Alara Vance. He had seen her only once before, a brief, sterile inspection. She looked no better now. She was a slip of a thing, lost in a threadbare dress the color of dishwater. Her skin was so pale it seemed to have a bluish, translucent quality, as if she were already halfway to being a ghost. Her only notable features were her eyes, a startling, lucid gray that seemed too large for her face, and a persistent, rattling cough that she tried to stifle in a small, worn handkerchief. She was the picture of genteel poverty teetering on the edge of the abyss. Perfect. He needed a wife. The ancient and convoluted entailments of the Blackwood estate demanded it. An heir was not merely desired. It was a contractual obligation to the past, a legal bulwark against collateral lines of the family he despised. But he had no time for the London season, no patience for the simpering debutantes and their matchmaking mothers. He had a nation to worry about, a network of spies to manage, a political war to wage. A wife was a distraction, a vulnerability. So he had instructed Pettigrew to find him the opposite of a London wife. Someone with just enough blue blood to be acceptable, but with no fortune, no connections, and, most importantly, no one who would make a fuss when she inevitably failed to thrive. Pettigrew had outdone himself. Alara Vance was an orphan, her parents having had the good grace to die in debt. Her health was, by all accounts, precarious. Her guardian was desperate to be rid of the financial and social burden. She was, in essence, a blank slate upon which a short, tragic history could be written without inconveniencing anyone of importance. Alastair moved to the desk, his boots making no sound on the thick carpet. He ignored the cousin and addressed the girl directly, his voice low and devoid of warmth. It was the same voice he used to deliver orders on a battlefield. "You understand the terms, Miss Vance?" It was not a question. She met his gaze. He had expected fear, or perhaps a flutter of feminine gratitude. He saw neither. Those lucid gray eyes held a flicker of something else. Defiance? No, that was too strong a word. It was a cold, hard assessment, as if she were the one making the purchase. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Her voice, when it came, was thin but clear, without the tremor he might have expected. "I do, Your Grace. The terms are explicit." The cousin squirmed. "She is most grateful, Your Grace. Overwhelmed by the honor. It is a fairy tale, truly." Alastair's gaze remained locked on Alara. "A fairy tale." He supposed it was if one's fairy tales featured dying princesses and crumbling castles. The Blackwood name carries with it certain expectations, the primary one being the provision of an heir. All other duties are secondary. He let the coldness of the statement hang in the air, a deliberate cruelty meant to strip away any lingering girlish fantasies. He was not offering a life, but a function. Alara's pale lips tightened. She brought the handkerchief to her mouth, smothering a cough that shook her slender frame. "I'm aware of my function." The bluntness of her reply was unexpected. It was a perfect echo of his own pragmatism, and for a fleeting second, it almost amused him. He felt a flicker of something that might have been interest, but he extinguished it immediately. Interest was a complication. He did not need complications. He needed a signature on a piece of paper. "Good." He turned to Pettigrew. "Is everything in order?" "Indeed, Your Grace." The solicitor pushed the marriage contract across the desk, his movements fussy and precise. "If you would both sign here and here." Alistair dipped the pen and scrawled his name, the sharp, angular letters a testament to his impatience. He pushed the document towards her. He watched as she took the pen. Her fingers were long and thin, the knuckles white. They trembled slightly, but she controlled it, her grip firming as she brought the nib to the paper. She wrote Ilara Vance in a hand that was surprisingly steady and elegant. Then she hesitated, her gaze on her own name. For a moment, he thought she might refuse. The thought was irritating. It would mean starting the entire tedious process over. But then she dipped the pen again, and below her name, wrote Duchess of Blackwood. The title looked absurd next to her worn dress and frail appearance. A mockery. He felt a sudden, sharp stab of distaste for the entire affair. It was sordid. Necessary, but sordid. "It is done," Pettigrew announced with a relieved sigh. He began to blot and sand the signatures. "Congratulations, Your Grace, Your Grace." Alistair ignored him. He looked at his new wife. Her face was unreadable, her posture rigid. She had not looked at him once since signing. She was staring at the wall behind him, her focus 1,000 miles away. She was already receding, fading into the role he had assigned her, a ghost in waiting. "A carriage will be ready in an hour," he stated, his tone final. "It will take you to Blackwood Manor. The housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, will see to your needs." Her head turned slightly, her gray eyes finding his again. "You're not accompanying me?" "I have business in London," he said flatly. "Urgent matters, va. Politics. The fate of nations. Things a sickly girl from a solicitor's office could never comprehend." A flicker of something, disappointment, fear, finally crossed her face, but it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by that unnerving, stony composure. "I see. Blackwood will be your home now," he said, the words feeling like a sentence. "The air is bracing." It was a lie. The air at Blackwood was damp and heavy with the scent of decay. "Try not to be a nuisance." He turned his back on her then, on the scent of dust and desperation, on the rattling in her chest that was the ticking clock of his freedom. He walked out of the solicitor's office without a backward glance, leaving his new duchess to the ink-stained silence. The transaction was complete. He had done his duty. Now he could forget her. He fully expected to. The carriage ride was a descent into a gray, waterlogged hell. Ilara had thought she understood the meaning of cold, had felt it seep into her bones during the threadbare winters in her cousin's unheated guest room. She had been wrong. This was a different kind of cold, a living entity that clung to the velvet squabs, frosted the windows with a film of ice, and tasted of wet stone and misery. For 2 days, she sat alone, jostled and shaken, as the muted, prosperous greens of the south bled away into the stark, bruised purples and browns of the north. The world outside the window seemed to be dissolving in a perpetual, weeping rain. Alistair, her husband, the Duke, had not even seen her to the carriage. A footman had handed her in, his expression carefully neutral, as if he were loading a piece of luggage. The Duke was a presence defined only by his absence, a hollow man who had purchased her life and then promptly misplaced it. "Try not to be a nuisance." The words echoed in the rhythmic clatter of the wheels, a final, dismissive commandment. He had not told her to live or even to try. He had simply instructed her not to bother him with the process of her dying. She coughed, a deep, racking spasm that left her breathless, her handkerchief spotted with a faint, terrifying pink. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at her. She pressed her forehead against the freezing glass, watching the landscape blur. She was the Duchess of Blackwood. The title was a phantom limb, a source of power she could feel but could not wield. She was a duchess with one dress to her name, a wedding ring that felt like a manacle, and a chest full of broken glass. On the evening of the second day, the carriage slowed, its wheels sucking at thick, viscous mud. Alara peered out. Through the deepening twilight and the relentless drizzle, she saw it. Blackwood Manor. It did not rise from the landscape so much as slump. It was a vast, sprawling mass of blackened stone, a jagged silhouette against a sky the color of a day-old bruise. Gables and turrets clawed at the clouds like skeletal fingers. Countless windows, dark and vacant, stared out like the empty eyes of a skull. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, choked the walls, its dark leaves plastered slick with rain. It was not a house. It was a tombstone, a monument to a slow, creeping death. The carriage lurched to a halt before a set of massive, iron-strapped doors. No lights shone in welcome. No servants rushed out. There was only the sound of the rain and the tired snorting of the horses. After a long moment, one of the carriage doors was wrenched open. The same footman stood there, his face impassive, holding a lantern that threw long, dancing shadows. "We are here, Your Grace." Alara gathered the thin wool of her cloak around her and descended. Her foot, clad in a worn leather boot, sank immediately into several inches of cold, clinging mud. The shock of it was so profound, so utterly miserable, that it almost made her laugh. A duchess, standing ankle-deep in mud before her new palace. The fairy tale her cousin had babbled about had taken a decidedly grim turn. She looked up at the house, at the sheer, oppressive scale of its neglect. The air smelled of wet earth, of mildew, and of something else, a deep, profound rot, as if the very stones were decomposing. A wave of despair, so powerful it made her dizzy, washed over her. She could die here. It would be easy. The house expected it. It was built for endings. The great doors groaned open, and a figure was silhouetted against the cavernous darkness within. A woman, tall and severe, holding a single, sputtering candle. She was dressed in black bombazine that seemed to absorb what little light there was. Her face was a collection of sharp angles and deep-set shadows. Her hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin over her cheekbones. "I'm Mrs. Gable," the woman announced, her voice as brittle as dry leaves. The housekeeper, she did not curtsy. Her eyes, small and dark, raked over Alara, taking in the cheap dress, the mud-splattered hem, the frailness of her form. The assessment was swift and contemptuous. "His Grace sent word you were coming," Mrs. Gable continued, her tone suggesting it was the most inconvenient news she had ever received. "Your rooms are prepared." Alara said nothing. She could feel the housekeeper's hostility like a physical force, another layer of cold to add to the damp air. She stepped past her, over the threshold and into Blackwood Manor. The scale of the entrance hall was immense, a cavern of shadows that swallowed the candlelight. A grand staircase, shrouded in cobwebs, swept up into darkness. Portraits of grim-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow her, lined the walls, their canvases dark with age and grime. The air inside was even colder than without, thick with the scent of cold ash, dust, and the undeniable odor of mice. She was a ghost in a mausoleum. Mrs. Gable led her up the grand staircase, her single candle doing little to pierce the gloom. Their footsteps echoed in the oppressive silence. They passed doors to countless rooms, all of them closed, all of them promising nothing but more darkness, more cold. Finally, the housekeeper pushed open a door at the end of a long, drafty corridor. "This will be your chamber." The room was vast and funereal. A gargantuan, four-poster bed draped in faded, moth-eaten velvet dominated the space. The air was frigid, a palpable draft snaking in from the tall, mullioned windows. A fireplace, large enough to roast an ox, sat cold and empty, a pile of gray ash in its hearth. The room was a perfect, exquisite instrument of death, designed to leach the warmth from a body and replace it with a permanent chill. Alara walked to the center of the room, her small form dwarfed by the oppressive furniture. She ran a hand over the damp coverlet on the bed. It felt like a shroud. "Will you require anything else, Your Grace?" Mrs. Gable asked, the title dripping with sarcasm. Alara turned, her own exhaustion and despair coalescing into a single, sharp point of anger. She met the housekeeper's malevolent gaze. "A fire," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "And food." A flicker of surprise in the woman's eyes. "The grates are cold. It will take time." "Then I suggest you begin," Alara said, the effort of the words sending another cough shuddering through her. Mrs. Gable's lips thinned into a bloodless line. Without another word, she turned and left, pulling the heavy door closed behind her, plunging Alara into near-total darkness. The sound of a key turning in the lock was loud and final in the silence. Locked in, a prisoner in her own home, Alara stood alone in the cold and the dark, the scent of decay filling her lungs. The Duke had not just abandoned her. He had buried her alive. The house was her coffin, and Mrs. Gable was her warden. She sank onto the edge of the monstrous bed, the damp cold of it seeping through her clothes, and for the first time since leaving London, she allowed a single, hot tear to trace a path down her frozen cheek. For 3 weeks, Alara lay dying. It was a passive, languid process, managed with chilling efficiency by Mrs. Gable and the house itself. The room was her world, a landscape of shadows and cold. A fire was lit each morning, a sullen, smoky affair that produced more gloom than warmth and was allowed to die by midday. Thin, greasy broth and stale bread were left on a tray outside her door, often forgotten for hours until they were as cold as the stone floors. The cough that had been a nuisance in London became a violent, tyrannical force, tearing at her lungs until she was weak and dizzy, her handkerchiefs permanently stained. She floated in a feverish twilight, the borders between waking and sleeping blurring. The house whispered to her in the long, dark hours. The wind moaned through the ill-fitting window frames like a keening mourner. The scuttling of rats in the walls was a constant, unnerving percussion. She dreamt of her husband, the Duke, his face a cold, impassive mask. In her dreams, he stood over her, not with concern, but with detached curiosity, as if observing a scientific experiment nearing its conclusion. Try not to be a nuisance. The housekeeper was a recurring wraith. Mrs. Gable would appear once a day, her black dress blending with the shadows, to look upon Alara with an expression of grim satisfaction. She never spoke, merely observed the progress of the decay, her presence a constant affirmation that this was how things were meant to be. Alara was an aberration, an unwelcome disruption to the house's slow, stately process of ruin, and the house was correcting the error. One afternoon, Alara awoke with a clarity that was terrifying. The fever had broken, leaving her weak but lucid. The room was cast in the weak, gray light of a sunless afternoon. The fire was dead, a mound of cold ash. The dregs of her lunch congealed on a plate by the door. She pushed herself up, her arms trembling with the effort. Her reflection in the dark, polished wood of the wardrobe was a stranger's. A skeletal creature with huge, haunted eyes and skin stretched tight over her bones. Her hair, unwashed and uncombed, was a lank mess around her face. This is how it ends, she thought, the realization devoid of emotion, a simple statement of fact. She would waste away in this forgotten room, a footnote in the history of a man who did not even know her name. Her life would be a brief, sputtering flame, extinguished by indifference. She lay back against the damp pillows, ready to let go, ready to slide back into the feverish dark and not return. She closed her eyes. The house seemed to sigh around her, a sound of contentment. It was winning. And then something shifted. A tiny, hard kernel of something that had been buried deep beneath the fear, and the sickness began to glow with a dull, red heat. It was anger. A white-hot, furious rage. Rage at the Duke for his callous cruelty. Rage at the housekeeper for her smug malevolence. Rage at this monstrous, rotting house for presuming it had the right to claim her. But most of all, rage at herself for her own placid, willing decline. She had been behaving like the dying woman everyone expected her to be. She would not. The decision was not a thought, but a physical jolt. It shot through her an electric current that made her muscles contract. Her eyes snapped open. "No," she whispered, her voice a raw croak in the silent room. With a groan that was part pain and part pure will, she swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her bare feet met the freezing floorboards, the shock of it another jolt to her system. She stood, swaying, gripping the bedpost for support. The room tilted violently, but she held on, her knuckles white. She would not fall. She would not lie down again. She took a step, then another, a slow, shuffling pilgrimage across the vast, empty expanse of the room to the door. She leaned her forehead against the cold, heavy wood. It was still locked. Of course it was. She rattled the handle, a weak, pathetic sound. "Let me out," she said, her voice barely audible. No response. She drew in a ragged breath, summoning what little strength she had left. "Let me out." The shout tore from her throat, raw and desperate, ending in a violent coughing fit that left her doubled over, gasping. Still nothing. Just the mocking silence of the house. Fine. If they would not open the door, she would find another way. She turned her attention to the room itself. It was a prison, but even prisons had weaknesses. Her eyes, sharp with this newfound, desperate clarity, scanned the space. The fireplace. It was a black, gaping maw. Too large. Too open. She shuffled towards it, her bare feet sticking slightly to the grimy floor. She peered up the chimney. A faint gray light was visible far above. The flue was wide, caked with soot, but potentially climbable for a creature as starved and thin as she had become. It was madness. She would likely fall or get stuck. She would die of exposure or suffocation. It was a chance. That was more than the bed offered. But before she could commit to that insane path, her gaze fell upon the poker resting on the hearth. It was long, heavy, made of wrought iron. A tool. A weapon. She picked it up. The weight of it was surprising, substantial in her trembling hand. She was no longer just a victim. She was armed. She walked back to the door, the iron poker held tight in her fist. She did not shout this time. She did not beg. She began to work. She jammed the tip of the poker into the gap between the door and the frame, near the lock mechanism. She put her shoulder into it, leveraging her meager weight. The old wood groaned. A splitter flew off. It was a small victory, but it was a victory. She worked for what felt like hours. Her muscles screamed. Her lungs burned, sweat and soot mingling on her skin. She was no longer a duchess, no longer a lady. She was a creature of pure, animalistic will, determined to break out of her own tomb. The wood splintered, cracked, and tore. The noise was horrendous, a screeching, tearing protest from the ancient house. Finally, with a great, shuddering crack, the portion of the jamb around the lock gave way. The door swung inward with a groan of defeated hinges. Alara stood in the doorway, panting, filthy, leaning on the poker like a staff. She was free. The corridor outside was dark and silent, but it was a path. It was a beginning. She took a deep breath of the stale, dusty air and took her first step out of the room where she was supposed to die. She was not a dying woman anymore. She was a living one, and she was going to make this house regret it ever tried to bury her. Alistair stood in the rain-soaked courtyard of Blackwood Manor and stared. He was bone-weary, a deep, soul-crushing exhaustion that went far beyond the physical fatigue of his journey from London. The political battles had been brutal, a mire of betrayal and Pyrrhic victories that had left him feeling hollowed out, scoured clean of any remaining sentiment. He had fled the city, seeking not solace, but silence. He had come to Blackwood expecting a grave, both hers and his own, a place to let the quiet rot seep in and still the ceaseless grinding of his thoughts. He had not expected this. The gate, which for years had hung from a single rusted hinge like a broken jaw, was repaired. It had swung open smoothly at his approach. The drive, once a river of mud and weeds, was now packed gravel, the worst of the overgrowth hacked away. And the house itself, it was still a hulking, grim beast of a place, but it was no longer a corpse. Smoke, thick and white and smelling of honest wood, plumed from not one, but 3 chimneys. Several of the black, vacant eyes of the windows now showed the warm, flickering light of lamps or fires. The scent on the air was not of decay and mildew, but of wood smoke, damp earth. And was that bread? He dismounted, handing the reins to his bewildered groom. His boots crunched on the gravel, a sound so alien in this courtyard that it felt like a sacrilege. For a year and a half, he had carried the image of this place in his mind as a tomb. He had sent a small stipend, enough to maintain the pretense of an estate, and received terse, uninformative reports from Mrs. Gable that confirmed his wife was still present. He had interpreted this as a stubborn refusal to die, an inconvenience he chose to ignore. He had expected to arrive to a house even further decayed, presided over by the ghost of a girl he had married and discarded. He pushed open the great front door. It did not groan. The hinges had been oiled. The cavernous entrance hall was still vast and shadowed, but it was clean. The thickest of the cobwebs were gone. The floor had been swept. A runner of what looked like rough, but clean sacking stretched across the stone flags. A single lamp on a small, polished table cast a pool of steady, golden light, holding the worst of the darkness at bay. It was deeply, profoundly unsettling. It was as if a corpse had sat up and tidied its own crypt. A man appeared from a corridor leading toward the kitchens. He was broad-shouldered, his face weathered, his hands calloused. He wore clean, sturdy work clothes. Alistair vaguely recognized him as Finch, the groundsman, a taciturn fellow who had been part of the estate for decades. Finch stopped short when he saw the Duke, his eyes widening in surprise. He wiped his hands on his trousers and gave a short, jerky bow. "Your Grace." The man's voice was rough, but respectful. We were not expecting you." "Evidently," Alistair said, his own voice sounding harsh in the quiet hall. He swept his gaze around the space. "There have been changes." Finch's expression was difficult to read. It was a mixture of pride and apprehension. "Her Grace has been industrious." Her Grace. The title, spoken by this man, did not sound like a mockery. It sounded like a statement of fact, like a rank earned. Alistair's unease sharpened into something that felt dangerously like anger. This was his house, his ruin. He had cultivated its decay, used it as an external manifestation of the hollowness within himself. Who was she to come here and defy it? To defy him? "Where is she?" he demanded. Finch hesitated. "The West Wing, Your Grace." "In the study." The study. Alistair's father's study. A room that had been locked and sealed for 20 years, ever since the old Duke had put a pistol in his mouth and painted the bookshelves with his brains. No one had entered it since. Without another word, Alistair strode past the groundsman, his long-legged pace eating up the corridor. The West Wing had always been the heart of the house's darkness, a place of drafts and bad memories. But the corridor was no longer a wind tunnel. Heavy curtains, patched but clean, had been hung over the worst of the windows. The air, while still cool, had lost its biting, damp edge. He reached the study door. It was closed. A sliver of light shone from beneath it. He did not knock. He was the Duke of Blackwood. He did not knock in his own home. He threw the door open. The room was transformed. The old blood-stained wallpaper was gone, replaced by a simple, clean whitewash. The cavernous fireplace, which had been a gaping black hole, now held a brisk, cheerful fire that crackled and spat, filling the room with a dry, pleasant warmth and the scent of burning applewood. Books had been removed from the shelves, cleaned, and stacked in orderly piles on the floor. The vast, ducal desk had been pulled into the center of the room, and behind it, a woman was sitting. It was Alara, but it was not the pale, sickly girl from the solicitor's office. The woman who looked up at his sudden, violent entrance was thin, yes, but not frail. There was a wiry strength to her, a vitality that seemed to radiate from her like the heat from the fire. Her hair was pulled back in a simple, practical knot, but it shone with health. Her dress was simple, made of dark wool, but it was clean and well-mended. There was a smudge of ink on her cheek, and her fingers were stained with it. She was surrounded by ledgers and papers, a pen held in her hand. She looked magnificent, and she was looking at him not with fear or surprise or even welcome. She was looking at him with the cool, appraising annoyance of someone whose work has been interrupted. Alistair stared, the words he had planned to say dying in his throat. The shock was a physical blow. He had been prepared for a ghost. He was not prepared for this vibrant, breathing, intensely alive woman who was looking at him as if he were an intruder. He finally found his voice. It came out as a raw, incredulous rasp. "You're alive." Alara set her pen down with deliberate care. A faint, ironic smile touched her lips, but did not reach her eyes. Those clear, gray eyes were as cold and hard as the northern sea. "A common misconception, Your Grace," she said, her voice low and steady, bearing no trace of the consumptive rattle he remembered. "One I have taken great pains to correct. I do apologize for the inconvenience." Alara watched him, this specter from a life she had burned away and rebuilt from the ashes. He stood in the doorway of her study, her sanctuary radiating a cold fury that seemed to suck the warmth from the room. He was taller than she remembered, broader in the shoulder, his presence filling the space with an unwelcome authority. His face, which she had only recalled as a mask of detached indifference, was now etched with exhaustion and shock. He looked like a man who had wrestled with demons and lost, only to come home and find his personal hell had been renovated. She felt a grim, satisfying flare of triumph. She had survived him. She had survived his house, his housekeeper, his monumental neglect. She had not merely survived, she had conquered. This room, this fire, these neat stacks of ledgers detailing the slow, painful resurrection of his dying estate, they were her spoils of war. He was a foreign king stepping on his shores he no longer ruled. "What have you done?" he finally asked, his voice a low growl. He stepped into the room, his muddy boots a desecration on the clean floorboards she and the housemaid had spent a week scrubbing. "The more pertinent question, Your Grace, is what have you done?" she countered, her tone level. She refused to be intimidated. She had faced down death in this house. A living, breathing duke was a triviality by comparison. "For nearly 2 years, you have done nothing. I, on the other hand, have been rather busy." She gestured with an ink-stained hand to the ledgers spread across the desk. "I have been preventing your ancestral home from collapsing into a pile of expensive mulch. I have been ensuring your tenants did not starve or abandon the land. I have been turning this mausoleum back into a house." His dark eyes swept over the papers, a muscle jumping in his jaw. "You had no authority." Alara allowed herself a small, cold laugh. "Authority? What novel concept. I had a leaking roof, a starving staff, and accounts so deep in arrears they were threatening to drag the whole county down with them. Authority was a luxury I could not afford. I had only necessity." She remembered those first months after breaking out of her room. The brutal, endless work. She had started in the kitchens, the only place with a reliable fire. She had dismissed Mrs. Gable on her second day of freedom, the woman's sputtering outrage a sweet, satisfying balm. Alara had simply locked her in the same room she herself had been imprisoned in, leaving the key on the hall table for anyone who felt inclined to release her. The old housekeeper had been gone by morning. Then, Alara had gathered the remaining skeletal staff, 2 frightened housemaids, the taciturn Mr. Finch, and a boy who helped in the stables, and made them a simple proposition. "Help me save this place, and I will see that you are fed. Work against me, and you can take your chances with the winter." It was Finch who had turned tide. He had looked at her, this half-starved girl with eyes burning with a feverish intensity, and had seen not a duchess, but a survivor like himself. He had nodded once and said, "The kitchen garden is fallow, but the soil is good." That was the beginning. They had boarded up the entire East Wing, consolidating their meager resources in the more defensible West. She had found the ledgers in this very study, the door unlocked by a key Finch had kept hidden for 20 years. The numbers told a story of aristocratic neglect, of funds drained for London frivolities while the estate rotted. She had spent nights by candlelight, her head pounding, teaching herself accounting, land management law. She had sold off 3 decaying and used cottages for lumber. She leased grazing rights on the northern fells to a sheep farmer. Small things, but they had brought in trickles of coin, enough for seed, for flour, for glass to repair the most crucial windows. Slowly, painfully, the house had begun to breathe again. The scent of baking bread replaced the smell of mildew. The staff, seeing full plates and receiving actual wages, transferred their loyalty to her completely. She was not their mistress by title. She was their leader by deed. And then she had found Rosamond. The memory was still sharp, a shard of ice in her heart. A locked door in the furthest, most neglected corner of the wing they inhabited. She had assumed it was just another decaying room, but sometimes in the dead of night, she heard sounds. A soft thumping, a low, rhythmic humming. The staff, when asked, would go pale and silent, muttering about old ghosts. But Alara did not believe in ghosts. She believed in secrets. One day, armed with her trusty iron poker, she had broken that lock too. The room inside was a horror. It was small, barred like a cell, with nothing but a straw pallet and a slop bucket. And huddled in the corner was a girl, or perhaps a young woman, with wide, terrified eyes and a mane of wild, tangled blonde hair. She wore a simple, filthy shift. She did not speak, only shrank away, making a low, wounded sound. It was Alistair's sister, Rosamond. The staff, in hushed, fearful whispers, had eventually told her the story. The girl had been different, prone to fits and long silences, an embarrassment to the proud Blackwood name. After the old Duke's death, their mother, before she fled to the continent, had ordered her confined, hidden away from the world, with only the cruel Mrs. Gable for a keeper. When Alistair inherited, he had simply continued the arrangement. He had left her there to rot, just as he had left Alara. Alara had not seen a monster. She had seen a prisoner. She had seen herself, locked in that cold, dark room. Her heart, which she had thought hardened into a practical, unfeeling stone, had cracked open. She had spent months coaxing Rosamond out of her shell. She brought her food herself. She sat and read to her, not caring if the girl understood. She brought her a stray kitten from the stables, and for the first time had seen a flicker of interest in those haunted eyes. She learned that Rosamond was not mad, but overwhelmed. Loud noises and sudden movements terrified her. But the quiet rhythm of the recovering house seemed to soothe her. The scent of herbs from the garden, the warmth of the kitchen fire, the repetitive motion of carding wool. These things grounded her. She was still silent, but her silence was no longer born of terror. It was peaceful. Rosamond was her greatest reclamation project. More than the house, more than the finances. She had saved a life that had been utterly discarded. Now, the man who had discarded it stood before her, demanding an accounting. "You have turned my house into a farmhouse," Alistair said, the words laced with contempt. "It is a home," Alara corrected him sharply. "Something I suspect you know very little about. It is warm, it is solvent, and it is safe." His eyes narrowed. "Safe?" At that moment, as if summoned, the study door creaked open further. A figure stood there, hesitant. It was Rosamond. She was holding a small basket of dried lavender. Her hair, though still worn long and loose, was clean and brushed, shining in the firelight. She wore a simple blue dress that Alara had sewn for her. Her eyes, wide and the same dark blue as her brother's, flickered nervously from Alara to the towering, angry man by the door. She took a half step back, a low hum of anxiety starting in her chest. Alistair froze. Every ounce of color drained from his face. He stared at his sister as if she were the ghost he had been expecting all along. The fury, the shock, the exhaustion, all of it was wiped away, replaced by a raw, naked horror. "Rosamund," he breathed, his voice cracking on the name. Alara rose slowly from her chair, her entire focus shifting to the frightened girl in the doorway. She kept her voice low and soft, the tone she always used. "It is all right, Rosie. It is only a visitor." She deliberately did not use his name or title. He was an unknown, a threat. She moved around the desk, placing herself between Rosamund and Alistair, a human shield. She reached out and took Rosamund's hand. It was trembling. Alistair took a stumbling step forward, his hand outstretched. "What is she doing out of her room?" he demanded, his voice a ragged whisper. Alara's own anger, cold and pure, returned with the force of a tidal wave. She looked at him over her shoulder, her gray eyes blazing. "She is living, Your Grace," she said, her voice shaking with a fury she did not try to conceal. "Here, in this house, with me." Something she was prevented from doing by your own monstrous cruelty. She squeezed Rosamund's hand. "You did not just abandon me here, die. You left her too. Did you ever once wonder if she was alive? Did you ever once ask?" He had no answer. He simply stared, his face a mask of utter devastation. The great Duke of Blackwood, the master of men and politics, looked utterly, completely broken. And in the face of his ruin, Alara felt not a shred of pity, only the cold, hard satisfaction of a truth finally, brutally spoken. The storm broke that night, a furious assault of wind and rain that seemed intent on tearing the newly mended roof from Blackwood Manor. It was a biblical tempest, the kind that reminded men of their own insignificance. Thunder cracked like the sky splitting apart, and lightning threw the stark northern landscape into brief, terrifying flashes of white. Inside, in the small pocket of warmth and light they had carved from the ruin, there was a fragile peace. Alara had settled Rosamund in her own small room near the kitchens, the quietest part of the house. The girl, though unsettled by her brother's appearance, had been soothed by the familiar ritual of bedtime. A cup of warm milk, a story read in Alara's low, steady voice. Alistair had been a ghost since the confrontation in the study. He had retreated without another word, his face ashen. Alara had heard him moving about in the rooms above, the heavy, restless tread of a caged animal. She had left a tray of food, bread, cheese, and a slice of apple tart outside the door to the master suite he had claimed, the same suite she had once been imprisoned in. It was a petty act, and she knew it, but it was satisfying. Let him see the door from the other side. She was in the study, trying to focus on the accounts, but the storm and the turmoil of the day made it impossible. The man was an infection in the body of the home she had healed. His presence disrupted every rhythm, soured every small victory. He was a walking, breathing embodiment of the past she had fought so hard to overcome. A crash from upstairs, louder than the thunder, made her jump. It wasn't the sound of the storm. It was the sound of breaking furniture, followed by a raw, guttural cry of pure agony. It was not a sound of anger, but of pain. Alara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her first instinct was to ignore it. Let him tear his own rooms apart. Let him rage. It was no concern of hers. He was the Duke. He could manage his own tantrum. But the cry came again, and this time it was undeniably a sound of terror. It was the sound of a man being torn apart from the inside. It was a sound she recognized, not from a battlefield, but from the fever wards of the charity hospital she had volunteered at as a girl. It was the sound of a mind breaking. Damn him. Damn his intrusion. Damn her own reluctant conscience. With a frustrated sigh, she took a lamp and headed for the stairs. The tray of food lay untouched outside his door. The door itself was slightly ajar. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was a wreck. A chair had been overturned, a wash basin shattered on the floor. And in the center of the room, Alistair was on his knees, his hands clamped over his ears, his body rigid. His eyes were squeezed shut, but his face was a mask of abject horror. He was shivering violently, though the room was not cold. The storm outside raged, and with every crack of thunder, his body convulsed as if struck. "The cannons," he muttered, his voice a choked rasp. "God, the smell, smoke, and blood. I can't see." He wasn't in Blackwood Manor. He was somewhere else entirely. A battlefield from his past, brought to life by the percussive fury of the storm. This wasn't a duke's tantrum. This was a soldier's hell. His haunted, exhausted look suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. He wasn't just burdened by duty, he was scarred by it, a walking wound. Alara felt a wave of something she refused to name. Pity? No. It was a pragmatic recognition of a problem that needed solving. A madman, however powerful, was a liability to the stable environment she had built. She had to deal with this. Her first thought was to call for Finch, but she dismissed it. This was a private, profound brokenness. To expose it would be a cruelty, and despite her anger, she found she was not capable of that. This was a task for her alone. She set the lamp down on a table, its steady light pushing back the frantic, flashing shadows from the lightning. She did not approach him as one would a frightened animal. She did not coo or soothe. She approached him as a problem to be managed. "Your Grace," she said, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through his muttering. "Look at me." He didn't respond, lost in his waking nightmare. She knelt in front of him, heedless of the shards of broken pottery. She did not touch him. Instead, she reached for a heavy wool blanket that had been tossed to the floor. She shook it out and, with a swift, efficient movement, wrapped it tightly around his shoulders, pulling it snug. The physical constriction, the sheer weight of it, was a tactic she had read about, a way to anchor a mind adrift in panic. His shivering lessened slightly. His muttering continued, but it was less frantic. She needed another anchor, something sensory. Her eyes darted around the room. On the mantelpiece was a small, dried bundle of rosemary she had placed there to combat the musty smell. She snatched it, returned to her place before him, and crushed the brittle stalks in her palm. The sharp, piney, medicinal scent filled the air around them, a clean, green smell that was the antithesis of smoke and blood. She held her open palm near his face. "Breathe," she commanded, her voice low and firm. "This is not cannon fire. It is thunder. You are not on a battlefield. You are at Blackwood, in the north of England. The year is 1818. You are safe." She repeated the words over and over, a litany of facts. A mantra of the present tense. She did not offer comfort. She offered data. She spoke of the room, the stone walls, the rain on the roof. She grounded him in the physical reality of the here and now. Slowly, agonizingly, it began to work. The rigid tension in his body began to ease. He took a shuddering breath, then another, the scent of rosemary filling his lungs. His hands slowly lowered from his ears. He opened his eyes. They were unfocused at first, clouded with the horrors he had been witnessing. Then, they cleared, and he saw her, kneeling before him in the lamplight, her face serious, her hand outstretched, offering not comfort, but the scent of an herb. The sheer, unexpected practicality of it seemed to shock him back into himself. He stared at her, then at the heavy blanket around his shoulders, then back at her face. The storm still raged outside, but the storm inside him had passed. He was left in its wake, exhausted, exposed, and utterly vulnerable. He looked down at the floor, unable to meet her gaze. A single, ragged word escaped his lips. He swallowed the sound raw. I froze. It was a confession, stark and unadorned. A soldier's deepest shame. Alara did not say, "It's all right." She did not offer false comfort. She simply nodded, as if he had commented on the weather. She sat back on her heels, giving him space. "The storm will pass," she said, her voice back to its cool, level tone. "You are here now. That is all that matters." She rose, her knees aching, and walked to the door. She paused, her hand on the handle. "I will have one of the maids bring up some hot water," she said, her back to him. "And I will make you some tea." It was not an act of kindness. It was an act of management, A broken Duke was a problem. A warm, caffeinated Duke might be less of one. But as she walked down the dark corridor toward the kitchens, she could not deny the shift that had occurred. She had seen the man beneath the title, the wound beneath the armor. And in saving him from his own mind, she had irrevocably bound him to her, and herself to him, in a way the marriage contract never could. The aftermath of the storm was a profound and unnerving silence. The wind had died, the rain had ceased, and the world outside the windows of Blackwood Manor was washed clean, glistening under a pale, watery dawn. Alistair sat in a chair by the now-cold fireplace in his chambers, the heavy wool blanket still wrapped around his shoulders. He felt scoured out, hollowed, but the frantic, clawing terror was gone. It had been replaced by a deep and mortifying shame. She had seen him, the Duchess he had abandoned, the woman he had treated with such callous contempt, had witnessed his utter unraveling. She had not screamed or run or dissolved in frightened tears as any proper lady would have. She had managed him, with a blanket and a sprig of rosemary and a voice like a ship's captain in a gale. She had looked upon his deepest, most private hell and had assessed it as an inconvenience to be dealt with. The humiliation of it was a physical ache, sharper than the memory of the cannons. A soft knock came at the door. He flinched, pulling the blanket tighter around himself. "Enter," he rasped, his voice hoarse. The door opened, and she came in, carrying a tray. She had changed out of her practical wool dress and into a simple wrapper, her hair braided down her back. She looked tired, her face pale in the dawn light, but her movements were as efficient and deliberate as ever. She placed the tray on the table beside him. It held a steaming pot of tea, a cup and saucer, a small jug of milk, and a plate of biscuits. She poured the tea, her hands steady. The simple, domestic sound of the liquid splashing into the porcelain was grounding, an anchor in the quiet room. She did not look at him. "The account for the South Pasture are a mess," she said, her voice calm and conversational, as if they were in the middle of a business meeting. "The tenant, Mr. Croft, claims he paid his lease in full for the past 2 years, but there is no record of the funds in the estate ledgers. The sums were sent to your solicitor in London." Alistair stared at her. She was talking about accounting. After what had happened, after the things he had cried out, she was talking about a tenant farmer. The sheer, breathtaking absurdity of it was a shock to his system. He had expected recriminations, or worse, pity. He had not expected agricultural finance. Petty grew, he said, his mind sluggishly beginning to work again. "He manages my personal funds." "He appears to have been managing the estate's funds as well," she replied, pushing the cup and saucer towards him. "And keeping a significant portion for his troubles, it would seem. The man is a thief." Alistair picked up the cup. His hand trembled slightly, and he steadied it with his other. The warmth of the porcelain seeped into his cold fingers. "I will have him ruined. I've already sent him a letter," Ilera said, taking a biscuit from the plate and nibbling on its edge, "informing him that all future correspondence regarding the Blackwood estate is to be directed to me, and that a full audit of his activities for the past 5 years will be commencing immediately. I suspect the missing funds will be found and returned with apologies by the end of the month." He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time without the lens of his own anger or shock. He saw the intelligence in her clear eyes, the formidable will that held her straight-backed and unbowed. She had not just survived this place. She had mastered it. She had mastered his corrupt solicitor from 200 miles away. She had done it all while he was in London, playing at power, oblivious and useless. "You did that?" he asked, the question sounding inadequate, foolish. "Someone had to," she said simply. She finished her biscuit and brushed the crumbs from her fingers. "The house needed a master. You were absent. I applied for the position." There was no triumph in her voice, only a statement of fact. A fragile truce settled between them in the quiet room, born not of forgiveness, but of a shared, practical reality. The house, the estate, the work. He had seen her strength, and she had seen his weakness. The power dynamic that had been so clear, he the Duke, she the disposable wife, had been irrevocably shattered. There was something else now, something undefined. Over the next few weeks, they began to function as a strange, reluctant team. The silence between them, which had once been a weapon, became a space for work. They spent their days in the study, a fire always burning in the hearth. He, with his knowledge of law and the intricate politics of the aristocracy, and she, with her hard-won, intimate knowledge of every field, every tenant, every leaking roof on the estate. He showed her how to draft a legally binding lease that favored the estate. She showed him Finch's maps of the old, forgotten drainage ditches that could, if cleared, reclaim the waterlogged western fields. He was shocked by her grasp of crop rotation and soil management. She was surprised by his patience in explaining the finer points of entailment law. One afternoon, they were bent over a large map of the estate spread across the desk. A dispute had arisen with a neighboring landowner, a boorish baronet who was claiming a swath of woodland as his own. "He's bluffing," Alastair said, his finger tracing the old boundary line on the map. "The original charter from the Third Duke is explicit. This land is ours, but proving it will mean a trip to the county records office. A day's ride. We can't spare Finch for a full day," Alara countered, looking at the list of tasks she had pinned to the wall. "Not with the planting schedule so tight." "I will go," Alastair said. Alara looked up at him, surprised. The Duke of Blackwood, running errands like a common clerk. "I'm capable of riding a horse and reading a document. Alara," he said, a ghost of a dry smile touching his lips. It was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it in his low voice was strangely intimate. "I am aware," she replied, her own tone carefully neutral, though her heart gave a strange little flutter. "See that you get a proper receipt for any copying fees. The county clerk is a notorious opportunist." Later that day, she found him not in the study, but in the stable yard. He had his coat off, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong, sinewy forearms. He was working alongside Finch, mucking out a stall. The sight was so utterly incongruous. The haunted Duke, the powerful politician, shoveling manure, that Alara stopped in the doorway, momentarily speechless. Finch nodded a greeting to her. Alastair paused, leaning on the pitchfork. He was not embarrassed to be caught at such a menial task. He looked grounded. The frantic, haunted energy that had clung to him was gone, replaced by a quiet focus. The physical labor seemed to suit him, to burn away the phantoms. "The stable boy is down with a fever," he said, by way of explanation. It needed to be done. It needed to be done. That was her philosophy, the core of her entire existence for the past 2 years. To hear it from him, to see him living it, was another small shock. She gave a single, sharp nod of approval. As she turned to leave, Rosamund appeared, drawn by the familiar sounds of the stable. She was carrying the stray kitten, now a sleek, well-fed cat, cradled in her arms. She saw Alastair and hesitated, her old fear flickering in her eyes. Alastair froze, the pitchfork held tight in his hands. He did not approach her. He did not speak. He simply stood still and waited, letting her assess him. It was the first time he had not treated her like a problem or a ghost. He was treating her like a person. Rosamund watched him for a long moment. Then, her gaze dropped to the kitten in her arms. She took a tentative step forward, then another, until she was standing a few feet away from her brother. She held out the kitten, an offering, a question. Alastair slowly, carefully put down the pitchfork. He knelt, so as not to tower over her. He looked at the kitten, then at his sister's expectant face. He gently reached out and stroked the cat's head with one finger. The cat purred. A small, beautiful smile bloomed on Rosamund's face. Alara watched from the doorway, a lump forming in her throat. The broken pieces of this family, scattered by cruelty and neglect, were slowly, tentatively, beginning to find their way back to each other. And she, the unwanted, discarded wife, was somehow the glue that was holding them together. The thought was both terrifying and wonderful. The fortress she had built for one was, she realized, becoming a home for 3. The world intruded on a Tuesday. It arrived in the form of a lathered horse and a royal courier, a splash of scarlet and gold against the muted greens and browns of Blackwood. The man's imperious presence in the courtyard, his uniform a stark reminder of a life of power and politics, felt like a violation. Alara saw him from the study window, and her heart, which had been slowly, cautiously unclenching over the past weeks, seized tight in her chest. She had allowed herself to become comfortable, a fatal error. She had started to believe in the quiet reality they were building, the shared work, the comfortable silences, the sight of Alistair teaching Rosamund how to braid a horse's mane. She had started to see him not as the Duke, but as a man who mucked stalls and knew the law, a man whose presence in the study next to her felt as natural and necessary as the fire in the hearth. She had forgotten who he was. The courier was here to remind her. Alistair was summoned from the fields, where he had been helping Finch repair a stone wall. He entered the study, his face flushed from the work, a smudge of dirt on his cheek. He saw the courier's dispatch, with its ostentatious royal seal, lying on the desk where Alara had placed it, and the easy, grounded piece fell away from him like a shed skin. The Duke of Blackwood returned, his shoulders straightening, his expression hardening into the familiar mask of command. "Leave us," he said to her, his voice clipped and formal. It was the voice he had used on their wedding day. Alara felt the cold slap of it. Of course, this was his world, a world of secrets and power in which she had no part. She was merely the housekeeper, the farm manager. She had mistaken a temporary truce for a permanent treaty. "Of course, Your Grace," she replied, her own voice frosted with a matching formality. She turned and walked out of the study, her back ramrod straight, and closed the door quietly behind her. She did not slam it. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing how much the dismissal stung. She walked down the corridor, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence of the house. The warmth of their partnership evaporated, leaving behind the old, familiar chill of abandonment. He would leave. Of course he would leave. The king had called. The world had called. This brief, strange interlude of domesticity was over. Blackwood was just a place for him to mend, a rustic infirmary. Now that he was healed, he would return to his real life, and she would be left here once again, the custodian of his ancestral home, the keeper of his forgotten sister. The role had expanded, but it was a role nonetheless. She went to the kitchen, the bustling, warm heart of her domain. But for the first time, it offered no comfort. She stared out the window at the kitchen garden, at the neat rows of cabbages and herbs she had nurtured from the mud. It was her kingdom, a small, provincial kingdom, but hers. She had built it for herself, out of sheer will. She did not need him. She repeated the words to herself like a prayer, but they sounded hollow. An hour passed, then another. The courier's horse was rested and watered. He stood in the courtyard, impatient. Finally, Alara heard the study door open and footsteps approach. It was Alistair. She did not turn from the window. She prepared herself for the inevitable. The cool, formal announcement of his departure. The instructions for the management of the estate in his absence. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. She could feel his presence behind her, a heavy, silent weight. Alara. She took a deep breath and turned to face him, her expression carefully composed, a mask of polite indifference. He was holding the dispatch in his hand. His face was unreadable. "I assume you will be leaving for London immediately, Your Grace," she said, her voice betraying none of the turmoil inside her. "Shall I have your things packed?" He looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. "The king requires my presence. There is a crisis in the cabinet. He demands my counsel." "The king's demands are not to be taken lightly," she said, the words tasting like ash. "You must go. Your duty calls." "Yes," he said softly. "My duty." He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent conversation passing between them that she could not decipher. Then he moved. He did not walk toward the front door. He walked to the massive kitchen hearth, where a large fire roared, a pot of stew bubbling over it for the staff's dinner. He stood before the flames, the dispatch held loosely in his hand. He looked at the heavy wax seal, at the elegant, demanding script. He looked at the tangible summons from the world of power and consequence, the world that had defined him, broken him, and now called for him again. Then he looked at her, and with a simple, deliberate movement, he tossed the dispatch into the fire. Alara gasped. The parchment blackened instantly, curling at the edges. The red wax of the royal seal melted, bubbled, and dripped like blood into the flames before being consumed. In seconds, the king's command, the call of the world, was nothing but a wisp of gray smoke disappearing up the chimney. Alistair turned back to her, his face illuminated by the firelight. The mask was gone. The Duke was gone. There was only the man who mucked stalls and mended walls, the man who sat with her in the quiet study, the man who had been broken and was slowly, painstakingly, being made whole. "The courier is waiting for a response," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I have already given it to him," Alistair said. "I told him the Duke of Blackwood is indisposed. Indefinitely." He took a step towards her, then another, until he was standing before her in the warm, fragrant kitchen. "My duty is no longer to a king in London," he said, his voice low and resonant with a truth that shook her to her very core. "My duty is to a leaking roof in the North Wing. It is to a tenant farmer with a grievance. It is to a sister who needs to be taught how to smile." He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers brushed her skin, a touch that was not romantic, but a profound and grounding anchor. "My duty is here," he said, his eyes holding hers, dark and serious and utterly committed. "You're my home, Alara. This place, this life you have built, it is my home." The wall she had so carefully constructed around her heart, the pragmatic defenses, the cynical armor, did not just crack. They crumbled into dust. The powerless survivor, the discarded wife, the pragmatic ruler of a ruined estate, all of those versions of herself fell away, leaving only the woman who was being offered the one thing she had never, in her entire life, possessed: a home, a partner, a choice. Tears, hot and sudden, filled her eyes and spilled down her cheeks. They were not tears of sorrow or despair, but of a hope so fierce and overwhelming it was painful. She did not try to hide them. For the first time, she let him see her vulnerability, her raw, unguarded heart. She did not speak. She simply leaned forward, resting her forehead against his chest, against the rough wool of his country coat that smelled of wood smoke and winter air. His arms came around her, holding her not with passion, but with a steady, protective strength. Outside, the courier, tired of waiting, mounted his horse and galloped away, taking the old world with him. They stood there for a long time, holding each other in the heart of the kitchen, a permanent fixture against the coming winter. Rosamund appeared in the doorway, the kitten in her arms, and watched them with quiet, understanding eyes. The house, their house, seemed to sigh around them, no longer a tomb, but a fortress, fiercely alive and completely, finally whole.